Hi, everyone. Thanks again so much for having me. If you've heard me speak before, you will remember that I always make a point to say that the reason I went to England to go to graduate school is not because I was feeling fancy or wanted a mountain of debt. It was because there is no education for stained glass in this country whatsoever. So I do educational opportunities like this, of course, to support my clients whenever I can, but also in hopes that everybody learns something today that you might take on in your everyday lives, because stained glass is a really important part of our American art historical past. So we're going to do a bit of a brief history here. I'm going to go over about 1,200 years in 25 minutes. It's going to be fun. And of course, we're going to tie it into the Basilica. So I just like to start by reminding everyone that stained glass, the way we make it today, the way the Basilica glass was made in the 1920s is the same way that the medieval craftsmen made stained glass. And we know that because of this 12th century monk named Theophilus, who wrote the treatise that you see on the left. He went traveling around and he looked at metal workers, painters, and glassmakers and recorded in painstaking detail how these processes were done in the 12th century. And again, very similar to how we still do it today. So I'm showing you two medieval windows here, an English one in the center and a French one on the right. And really just what I want you to observe is that they're fairly simplistic. I mean, it's amazing that they even exist at all, but they're fairly simplistic. There's a limited color palette, and they are made with something called mouth-blown glass, which you can see through. Mouth-blown or antique glass, sometimes it's called antique glass. It doesn't pertain to the age. It's actually the methodology of how it's made. So what happens is the ingredients of glass, which are sand, silica, and lime, are put into a kiln or a forge. They turn molten, and then you can see the little guy on the far left has taken a gather of glass on his blowpipe. He then blows air into it to create a globe. He turns his blowpipe facing downwards to create a cylinder shape. Gravity helps with that. And ultimately, it is laid flat and cut into a sheet. This is this cute little antiquarian drawing that makes this process look so simple, but in reality, it's really labor intensive, and that molten glass has to go back and forth into the kiln many times for this process to happen. The result, though, is that you get this very gorgeous surface of glass that's not perfect, which means it reflects light in a multitude of ways. You maybe have an older home with double-hung wood sash windows, in which case you'll see this kind of wavy glass. And on the right, you're seeing the crown method of antique glass, which is a similar labor-intensive process, which ended up making large sheets of glass. It was figured out pretty early on. You know, a lot of folks seem to think that all glass is stained, so we're going to go over some semantics. In reality, a very small portion of glass is actually stained. They began adding chemical elements to color glass quite early on. So for example, if you add cobalt to that mixture that I told you, you're going to get blue. So that glass is inherently colored all the way through. In the industrial era, it became clear, work smarter, not harder. And during this time, the constant process of making mouth-blown glass, being that it was so labor-intensive, and with the industrial age, they've learned that now you can mix your molten ingredients in the kiln. Here's this gentleman who's now going to pour it onto an iron table. It is not being blown on a blowpipe anymore. And it's ultimately, you'll see in a second, it's going to be rolled through two iron rollers, and it's going to come out as a sheet. And what this meant, you can see on the right hand a catalog page from the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, a multitude of colors from the last slide and textures that you're seeing here were produced at the apex of glassmaking. It's amazing. You can have all these wild textures of glass that were sometimes proprietary steel rollers for these companies. Unfortunately, a lot of them have been lost to time. So now as a conservator, it's very tricky to try to match some of these very rare textures of rolled glass. There are three ways to decorate stained glass. Now, again, this is kind of part of the vocabulary lesson. It's not technically stained glass unless it's decorated in some way. And decoration can be, we're going to go over the most common three forms. So on the left, this is something called grisaille paint, from the French meaning gray. And this is God the Father from 1408 at the York Minster. Every line that you see, his little eyelashes, the little hair curls in his beard and his hair, now this is done with grisaille glass. It is a mixture of ground up glass and metal oxides. It comes in a powder. The glass painter is going to mix it with a vehicle and a binder, and it assumes the texture of acrylic paint. They apply it to the glass, and then it's fired in a kiln. While the glass paint is, before it's been fired, it's very fragile. So you're able to sort of scratch out these tiny little details to create this level of design. In the center, you're going to see a detail from the basilica of this beautiful angel. And this is silver stain. Now, this is the namesake of stained glass. So the hair, you'll see that there's kind of this really nice lemony yellow sort of different depths spread out. Silver stain is silver nitrate. It is applied to the back of the glass and fired in a kiln, and a chemical reaction actually happens to stain the glass yellow, much like wood stain. And silver stain can range from this gorgeous lemon yellow to a very deep amber color. It can be sort of unpredictable at times, but that is the namesake of stained glass. And on the right, you are seeing enamel glass paint, which is similar to grisaille in the sense of its chemical composition, but you're getting a much wider range of colors here. You're getting pink, you're getting blue, and it's kind of painted sort of a little bit more like a canvas rather than with the grisaille, you're kind of going piece by piece. Traditionally, stained glass is made with lead. So in the top left, you're seeing, or the left side of the page, you're seeing the different kinds of profiles some of the different kinds of profiles that lead could come in. I want to draw your attention to letter A. You're going to see the heart and the flange. Now, this is kind of the strength of the lead matrix. This is very important. Lead comes in long strips called came. Lead is pliable. So as you can see in the right-hand image here from many years ago where I was building a panel, the long strips of came are bent around the pieces of glass and held in place until you ultimately all get it back together, and it will be soldered together to create a matrix, or essentially a basket, to hold all the pieces of glass within. Later on, we started using zinc and copper, but the basilica windows are made of lead. So stained glass didn't change for about 1,000 years, and that is until the Americans got their hands on it, actually. So on the left, you're seeing a kind of a quintessential medieval window, and on the right, you are seeing a 20th century window by the Tiffany Studios, which I'm sure that you've heard of. Some major differences here. There's a much wider range of color that you're seeing in the Tiffany Studios window. There's also no glass paint in this window whatsoever. If you have ever been or will ever go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I highly suggest seeing this autumn landscape. It's in the American wing. You can't miss it. It's huge. And this is a hugely significant change. And the reason I'm kind of pointing it out is because the processes that happened in the late 19th and 20th century in America directly impacted the production of the windows here at the Basilica. So the two big American innovations, one is the use of something called opalescent glass, which is on the left. This is a modern example, but it's kind of a nice image to show you what I mean. Whereas the antique glass, as I said earlier, is transparent, you can see through it. The opalescent glass, you cannot. Basically, when it's cooling, when it's during the annealing process, the temperatures are manipulated, which is forcing the glass on the inside to crystallize. So it's creating this semi-opaque and kind of sparkly appearance. And then the second innovation on the right is something called plating. You can see the kind of green broccoli-shaped piece in the center. You might notice how it's sitting proud of some of the pieces around it. Louis Tiffany and his contemporary John Lafarge during this time were ultimately stacking, layering, plating, however you want to say it, pieces of glass on top of each other and building them all within these very complicated lead and copper matrices to adjust the light, adjust the color, create shadow. It opened up an enormous ability of artistic expression that previously didn't exist in stained glass, which we can do another lecture another time about the opalescent movement in America. So very quickly, how it's made. These are actually tools that exist in your archives. These were some of Gay-T Studios' historic tools, and these are stained glass window tools. And on the left, you're seeing a cartoon from your window scheme, a design. The first step is that a design is submitted to the client. So once the client says, yes, I love it, make it for me, then we are going to move to the cartoon phase, which is the image you're seeing on the right. Now, this is a completely different window, but you can see to the left of this little gentleman, there's the small image, which is the accepted design, and he is creating the full-scale version of this, which is called a cartoon. This is one-to-one, full-scale, exactly the size it needs to be. But what's important here is he's now indicating where the lead is actually going to be placed as well. Next, the glass is selected. This can happen with the artist, with the client, some combination of both. And then that really gorgeous cartoon I showed you is reduced again into something called a cut line, which is kind of like a dressmaking pattern. The blue ballpoint pen lines are indicating where the heart of the lead lies. So they're going to cut out these pieces to create this little pattern in order to cut the glass. And I found this video online. I have no idea who this person is, full disclosure. But the glass cutting process here done with a diamond wheeled glass cutter, I'm just showing you how labor intensive this really is. You have to do multiple cuts to get every single piece. Sometimes you break it, you have to start over again, and they have to be exactly right. If you don't cut it the right size, the window is not going to fit in the hole, and that's very embarrassing for everyone. So you just want to make sure that it's exactly right. So on the left, you're seeing all of the cut glass. It has not yet been painted, so it kind of doesn't really show too much right now. You don't know exactly what you're looking at. So that now we're finally getting to the painting of the glass process, which again is on the right. You can see the glass is being painted. Depending on the process, the style, the artistic goals, glass can be fired several different times. Multiple types of paint can be used. And I like to point this out, and we're going to see some details in the basilica windows again, because it takes a real level of knowledge and artistry to understand how to mix the paint, how to yield the ultimate design that you're hoping to get through all of these firing processes. They have to be on the right schedule, literally the right amount of time, at the right temperature. It has to cool at the right speed. It's so complicated. It's not something that I have ever really attempted. So the glass artists, which I think are a very underrated group of artists in this country. And just so you can see, there's two examples of glass that has been fired in the kiln on the left, and when it's unfired on the right, it looks like it's a completely different color. So this is kind of going back to what I'm saying about how much skill and knowledge it really takes to understand what you're doing and what it's going to yield once it's complete. So once the glass is fired, there's an example of the kiln on the left. It goes to the leading process, technically called glazing, which I showed you earlier. And then it is soldered. That is a very young me soldering windows at my first stained glass job. So we want to solder all of these window joints, all the points where the lead meets, because that's what's going to hold this together. That's the joint of the entire process. Once it's together, we take a linseed oil-based weatherproofing putty. It's texture of silly putty. And you push it under all of the lead flanges, like I indicated earlier, and this is what's going to waterproof your window. It's the most tedious, the most difficult for your biceps, and the longest amount of time, but it's also the most important, because without this, the windows leak. Because it's oil-based, at the end it will leave this kind of gloopy residue behind, so we either use sawdust or whiting to buff that out and clean it up at the end, which is what you're seeing on the right. And lastly, the setting. Traditionally, the medieval windows were set directly into stone frames, which I'm showing you on the left. There's a groove that's cut out. One side is deeper than the other. So the panel, you find which side is deeper, the panel goes in that side, and you can kind of work it back into being centered. At the Basilica, you have a galvanized steel framing system from the 20s, which we will get into later, which actually makes my life and all the studio's lives as conservators much easier than having to chisel them out of the stone. So I want to talk about your windows now. So the stained glass is a cohesive collection that was glazed by the Thomas J. Gaytee Studio over a pretty short amount of time. It was 21 months, so March 1925 to December 1926, and the windows cost $40,000. So Thomas Jefferson Gaytee was born in 1874 in New York City. He is repeatedly cited as working for Louis C. Tiffany, who I've been mentioning, the Tiffany lamps, the Tiffany studios. But the duration of his employment and the capacity in which he was actually employed is I've not yet completely figured out. A 1926 article about a Methodist church in Oklahoma states that he was for 12 years the chief designer of the Tiffany Studios of New York, which would be a huge honor. And given his lifelong involvement with stained glass and church interior decoration, it definitely stands to reason that he did indeed work for one, if not both, of the departments at Tiffany Studios. And as you're seeing on the right, that is the 1900 census listing him as an artist for his profession. In 1901, I did a lot of digging. In 1901, the New York City directories are listing his profession as merely as a designer. And then in 1905, he started to move west to Philly, and that directory again lists him as a designer, which obviously that's a big umbrella. A lot of different things can fall under that. By 1907, he was in Pittsburgh, and the Pittsburgh Art Glass and Mosaic Decorative Company, which billed itself as the largest glass-making establishment in Pennsylvania, is where he fell. And you can see in the red box there is a reference for that's an advertisement for their studio in Pittsburgh. It's referencing his employment again with Tiffany Studios. So clearly he was very proud of this, and anyone he worked for wanted to also make it quite known. He continued west. By 1911, he was in Chicago with the Decorative Glass Company. Unfortunately, by 1912, 3 creditors petitioned a judge to declare that company bankrupt, so yikes. But by 1918, he's finally in Minneapolis, and he was working evidently as a salesman for the Ford Brothers Glass Company, which later became the Ford McNutt Glass Company, which was a leading manufacturer of glass by 1896. And on the right there is a 1909 advertisement that states, "We refer you to our windows in 1,500 churches in 26 states." That's a sizable amount of glass that was made by the Ford brothers during that period. So this video, which I took on the lift that I've kind of repurposed for this, I'll pause it when it gets to the right point, but the tower windows is what I really kind of want to talk to you about. So Gaty began to work for the Ford Company by 1918, and in 1924, this large fire occurred. And it seems like at that point was when Thomas Gaty purchased the surviving materials from the Ford Company. When they left the business of art, they left the business of stained glass and focused purely on plate glass. And it seems like, well, on the right-hand side, you're seeing I think it might actually be the last commission by the Ford Brothers Glass Company, which exists in the Basilica archives. They completed the tower windows, or the dome windows, rather, in your building, which, again, I think it's the last thing that they actually did. It's stamped paid, and everything is on there indicating that they did in fact do this. So at that point, Gaty established his own business. I would wager here from my art historical research that he was there when the Basilica tower windows were made and when the fire happened, and then it kind of made sense that he sort of created his business and walked into an opportunity to glaze the rest of the windows in this entire building. It seemed like he was quite a smart businessman. And his contribution, his contribution to the Basilica is very clearly indicated in this Minneapolis Tribune article, which exists in the archives and you can also find online. So I want to talk to you a bit about the scheme in general. So the upper level, or in my terminology, we would call the clerestory, is a stained glass scheme that illustrates the principal of life events of Mary, which was proposed by the rector of the day, Reverend Reardon. And the lower nave windows of each show a prophet of the Old Testament who prophesies the event shown directly above. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but if you see Isaiah here in the middle image, the verse beneath him says, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son." The Annunciation appears directly above that. So you can see how it's kind of a one-to-one. You're reading across as well as up and down in this window scheme. I do want to shout out the archives. At the Basilica, I've worked in a lot of buildings, I've met a lot of folks, and your archives are really, really good. Over time, you've clearly made an effort to keep what was important to you, and it creates the whole portrait of what's happened to you over time, which is really excellent for me as a conservator and for any other future historian. There's newspaper articles, there's invoices, there's all sorts of stuff, but it also includes almost the full scheme of the original designs that were presented by Gaty Studios to the Basilica, an example of which you're seeing on the left. And I do want to also mention Florence Neubauer, who is credited with the painting and the repairing of these windows for decades. I like to indicate the female stained glass artists when I can, and she had quite an important job here with Gaty Studios. I've mentioned a couple of times about Gaty's, ties to Tiffany Studios. I'm not an art historian. I obviously have a background in art history, and I clearly really like it. So this is just my own opinion, take it or leave it. But on the left is one of Thomas Gaty's angels, and on the right is one of Frederick Wilson, who is the chief designer for the ecclesiastical department of Tiffany Studios for his entire career, hugely influential artist. And I personally see some inspiration from Frederick Wilson's angel in the Thomas Gaty scheme, which especially with those very curved bow-shaped lips, the expressive eyes, and the gorgeous blonde curls that curl away from the face. I mean, you can see, once you understand Frederick Wilson, you could walk into any building and point out a Frederick Wilson. And I see a lot of it in a very good way in Thomas Gaty's work. So we're going to take a closer look a little bit. So we talked about the antique glass at the beginning, which is what was used here. So the detail on the right, you can actually see the tree from outside the basilica showing through the glass because it is transparent. The figures are all comprised of this colorless or white glass background painted with the grisaille paint. So much detail exists here, from the lines in the hair, the muscles in the neck, the eyelashes, and of course the gorgeous application of silver stain. I think I've probably indicated enough how much work went into making these, but the paint isn't actually the only thing giving this great detail here. This is one of my favorite topics in stained glass. It's that of glass selection. This is really what, in my opinion, separates the highly sophisticated studios from the kind of more ordinary pedestrian makers. On the left-hand side, you're seeing a character from one of the windows who is quite healthy. On the right, you are seeing Christ when he is coming down from the cross, so after he has passed. The glass that was chosen for his skin is this grayish-green tint that doesn't appear in any of the other figures. And it's clearly to indicate the difference in his pallor after his death. This was a conscious choice. It's very subtle, but it's also quite clever and powerful for the overall scheme. A couple more notes about the sophisticated decoration. On the left, compared to some of the other images, it might seem a bit boring, but I love it because in the yellow section, you're seeing these little tiny line marks that were scratched out before the glass was fired, and how the blue surrounding it in some cases is brighter, and there's these highlights and sparkles, and this was all done through so much effort on the glass painting side of things and multiple firings in the kiln. And then on the right, it's one little isolated example, but this does occur across the Claire story. This is the plating that I showed you earlier that really put Louis C. Tiffany and the rest of the 19th and 20th American stained glass makers on the map. I'm assuming that Thomas Gay-T would have learned this from his time at Tiffany Studios. It's used quite sparingly and intentionally here at these windows, but it does exist, and there is quite a lot of it. Acid etching is another thing that was used here. The left-hand image is not from the basilica, but it's a very clear indication of what I'm hoping to explain to you. So flashed glass is a clear, colorless glass that is basically overlaid with a very thin layer of a secondary color on top of it, and it's fused together. So in this case, on the far left, it's a red over clear flashed. The medieval craftspeople started doing it, and again, it's done up through today. Hydrofluoric acid is used to basically melt off the portions of the color that you want to reveal the clear glass underneath, which is what you're seeing on the left. That's a simplistic version. All they did was apply the acid, and you're getting the design coming directly through. At the basilica, and that circle, the central circle with the quatrefoil, now that's one piece of glass. It's red over clear glass, and the design of the yellow, what's now yellow, and the sort of swirly bits were eaten away with acid, and then it was silver stained. That one piece of glass took days to get this level of design and attention to. And on the right, you can see sort of an outside reflected light version of what acid etching looks like. It does eat away at a layer of the glass, so you can actually feel the step on it with your finger if you were to touch it. There is one remaining ventilator latch in the whole building, and it reads Chicago Metallic Steel Company. All the other latches have been taken off, assuming because of the heating and air conditioning that you now have, you don't want to be opening and closing these windows all the time. It can break them. But I did a little digging, and I found the catalog that these window frames were actually purchased out of. And on the left is the detail of your ventilator sashes here. And what it told me is that it was always indicated to have two glazing layers. There's two spots in there, two slots, one for stained glass and one for protective glazing, and that's original 1920s engineering. So you can see an old picture of the church here where the protective glazing, the secondary glazing layer has been installed, but the stained glass has not yet been installed. Most of the original protective glazing, which was this kind of brownish, apparently brownish tinted, very thick glass, has been since removed and replaced with a more clear glass that you see on the outside now. But there's one or two windows way at the north end of the church where the singing angels are, where the bottom of which the original protective glazing does still exist, where my red arrow is. I searched very hard to find it, but it is there. And it's nice to know that it's still intact. So in 2023, I spent weeks up in the lift looking at all of the windows to understand the condition, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I observed. There have been previous repairs and a long time of loving these windows. So on the left, you're seeing this kind of goopy line. It's a silicone repair that was done in place, basically there was a crack in the glass and somebody just went up there and smeared silicone on it. On the right, you're seeing a piece of glass indicated by the red arrow that was replaced. I'm not sure what happened to the original glass, but somebody, for whatever reason, felt the need to replace it, and you could see it's not quite of the quality of the surrounding pieces around it, and this occurs throughout the scheme. There is a strap lead repair shown on the left, the one piece of lead that kind of doesn't look like anything else. This is a Band-Aid repair. It's something that people do to cover a break rather than truly repair it. And this is kind of an older school way of window restoration in this country. On the right, you're seeing just an untreated break. Again, glass breaks. There's the healthiest of windows, there's little bits occasionally that break, which we see here. Up in the clerestory level, there are 10 or 12 those big circles with the angels holding the scrolls above the clerestory level. And every single one of them, they're failing in the same location. So where the red arrows are, there's a little strip of daylight showing through. It's an inherent design flaw. The windows don't have enough support, and the way there's like these concentric circles of how they did the design, it's just an inherent flaw that could be fixed with additional support, but it's important to note that all of them are failing in the exact same place. Your building has gone through quite a bit of quote-unquote regular maintenance. In this case, the stained glass was left in its vertical plane and somebody re-weatherproofed it with linseed oil while it was still in the building. That is not something that we do or I allow anymore, because you're putting a horizontal pressure on a vertical object, you're pushing it, and what happens is what you see on the right, the lead will start to break because it just can't handle that type of movement. The weatherproofing putty on the interior, you can see there's a bit of, couple of missing bits. Again, the linseed oil dries, it falls out. This is fairly typical for windows of this age. And when that happens on the right, you're seeing what we call light leaks, which are the exposed edges of the glass because the putty has fallen out. There are interior watermarks from condensation and potentially from stone issues, which if I didn't say it earlier, I'll say it now. Water is pretty much the #1 enemy of stained glass. We really want to try to keep them dry. So when we see watermarks like this, it's a good note to know what's going on. The ventilators were all caulked shut at some point in the past. You can see this kind of like gloopy, sloppy caulking. Again, that was just so they wouldn't be opened. And at some point, in a more positive sense, somebody added what we would call interior fins, which you're seeing around the little foot in the right-hand image. And that's an additional strengthening method. So somebody kept the windows original, but added some additional bars to help strengthen them. And that person, is after my own heart, because that's what I'm trying to do today. The protective glazing that was added at some point in the past, there's divisions between the panels, which you could see where the red arrows are. Those go straight across every panel, it's a division. So there's 3 pieces of plate glass in the protective glazing with 2 divisions. They put a little louver at the bottom in an attempt, I guess, to ventilate that space, but unfortunately it's only ventilating the bottom panel because the air can't pass through those horizontal bars to the top. So it's an underperforming system. And on the right there, you're just seeing that the old alligator skin-looking sealant, which is beginning to fail on the outside. And again, everything reaches the end of its serviceable life. That's not atypical. So we did a probe to confirm the condition. I was fortunate enough to have the option because other tests were going on in the building and mock-ups. So we wanted to confirm what I think that I saw, or what I know that I saw, the ease of the removal of the framing system, the stability of the lead matrix. We wanted to identify the type of protective glazing that was currently installed and do a cleaning mock-up. So we took out the whole left window, and you can see these 2 gentlemen, how wide these windows really are, and what big pieces of glass. It took 2 men to carry them, and I was very stressed when it was happening, but they got them down. So here's what, again, your framing system is looking like on the left. The protective glazing is still installed. There's a central channel, which is meant to be for air, and then the stained glass is installed on the interior of that. And the additional, after everything else I've already told you, the additional sort of issues we found when we removed the window were that the perimeter lead came, which is what is touching these galvanized steel frames, is really at the end of its life. It's not uncommon two different kinds of metal have been touching each other in a fairly wet environment, so it is degraded. And of course, the little border that is concealed by the framing has a lot of more breakage in it than we're seeing elsewhere in the panels. So this might sound bad, but I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. There is a solution. I really love this image. See, I'm a New York Giants fan, so this is something I put on my Instagram every week. So that solution is something called preventative conservation. So I've proposed a way to fix the existing issues, which are really, in the grand scheme of windows that I look at, not awful. But we are at a critical point in time where maintenance needs to happen in order to prolong the existing condition of these windows and their existing materials. In the United States, the outlook, as you will note, is much different than it is in the UK. We are looking at windows in this country as functional objects, part of the building envelope, that need to be regularly maintained, much like repointing brick. The Europeans are looking at stained glass as an artwork, and they need to be conserved with a lighter touch, the way a painting or a sculpture would be. In reality, there's a balance of those things, but what I do in my consulting firm and what I've recommended here is to do preventative conservation to keep your existing materials intact, to fix the issues, but not take them apart, not re-lead them, not inherently remove original materials for the future. And the way to do that, what we've recommended, and hopefully we're going to work out, is to internally vent them. So we're going to, through this galvanized steel system, there is a way to get airflow from the bottom to the top in that interspace from the inside of the building, leaving the exterior plate glass alone. I don't have to bore you with all the details of that, but what it does do is keep the stained glass temperate and dry on both sides, so it's eliminating condensation and therefore not affecting the stained glass in a negative way, which prolongs its life for a very long time. And these techniques are what will keep these windows in place for your great-great-grandchildren to enjoy. And that is all I have for you today, so thank you so much.